Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream on the Shirai podcast. And today I'm joined by Doctors Robert M. Price and Bruce Chilton. And today we'll be discussing the book they both contributed to, The Brother of Jesus, James Adjusting His Mission, and the link to purchase the book will be in the description below in the pinned comment. That being said, Dr. Chilton, Dr. Price, thank you both very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Yeah. Thank you both for joining me. So the first thing I want to get us started with is can you both tell us a little bit about this book? What was the goal of this book in relation to telling people about the brother of Jesus, James?
Well, the thought behind it was that it emerged from what was called the consultation on James, which we established at Bard College on the basis of the work of a very interested donor whose name was Frank Crone, who has since passed away, I'm afraid. Frank was committed in his Judaism and was fascinated by the figure of James, the brother of Jesus, and became a kind of evangelist for James. I was really impressed by him, I must say. And he approached me and my colleague at Bart at the time, Jacob Neusner, about establishing a series of conferences, and out of those conferences also to develop volumes. So we did that. And when we came to this book, it was a part of a decision at the time to depart from our more technical work, which we predominantly published with Brill, and to move into a semi-popular direction as part of Frank Crone's determination, which I always admired, to see to it that not only was James understood, but also that there would be an awareness, a broader awareness in the United States of the very fact of James. You know, his problem in being Jesus' brother is he's Jesus' brother. So who exactly wants to talk about him? You constantly have to overcome that hurdle in order to get anywhere at all. So that is really the background of the piece. And we were very happy in the way in which it turned out.
So Bob, did you want to add something?
Actually, I'm embarrassed to say I have no real recollection about the origin of the book. I just was lucky to get into it. I don't even remember how that came about.
Well, it just came about because of our earlier contact, Bob, in the Jesus seminar. And I know you had an interest, and we had several issues that we wanted to pick up on. And so, as we did regularly during the life of the consultation, Jack Neusner and I simply contacted those people whom we thought would be able to permit us to make an advance along one of the lines that we had established for inquiry.
So now I want to shift to discussing what you both think about James anyway, which I'm sure will overlap with what you've both said in the book anyway. How do you both look at James, and what are the differences in opinion that you both have on the matter?
Well, I yield to my mentor. I'm not that lucky, but the senior scholar, this guy, he's the one. I'll PS something, but
okay. Well, let me start actually not with James, but with the position attributed to James, which I think is much more interesting, and also from the point of view of critical study, in my opinion, the place from which investigation should commence. You know, typically when you're dealing with the biography of a person, you would try to do it with the early life and the development, which makes all perfect sense under many, many circumstances. But when the record is fragmentary and sometimes controversial, I think it's more important to begin with the issue of influence. And on the matter of influence, there, I think we can say more about James. And what we can say is also much, much more interesting from the point of view of the development of Christianity and its relation to Judaism. Typically, I get this not only from students, but sometimes from scholars. Sometimes James is simply dismissed as being an opponent of Paul's. And because he's an opponent of Paul's, and because Paul refers to people who disagreed with him as belonging to the circumcision, it is asserted that James, unlike Paul, wanted to insist upon circumcision as a condition of Gentile conversion to Christianity. That's exactly the position that's not attributed to him by Paul himself in his letter to Galatians, or by the author of the book of Acts in chapter 15. There it's quite plain that James occupies a difficult mediating position between what was indeed a major argument and, in my view, a legitimate argument. That is, if you believed, as many early Christians did, that the significance of this movement centered on Jesus was that the promises of Israel were to be extended to non-Jews. And if you thought this had actually been a part of the prophetic teaching, which is also very well established, then when you assert that and when you say that they may adhere to the promises of Israel, should they be required to keep the covenant of circumcision and all that is associated with that? Now, there's a group in the book of Acts referred to as Pharisees who believed, who made the assertion, well, yes, the sign of the covenant is circumcision. It says so in the Torah, and therefore this should be required. And the group whom Irenaeus in the 2nd century refers to as the Ebionites continued with that insistence over time. And there does appear to have been I guess I could call it circumcision faithful group of believers in Jesus that existed for several centuries. Paul, on the other hand, famously insisted that no, the requirement of circumcision could not be made of Gentiles. James is put in the position in the book of Acts, and implicitly Paul acknowledges this. He's put in the position in the book of Acts that circumcision should not be required, but that, nonetheless, Gentiles who converted should be required to maintain certain aspects of the Torah in order to indicate that, in fact, they acknowledge the authority of Moses. So that famously they should not eat foods that had been notionally sacrificed to idols, because that would be idolatry. They should not consume blood or eat meat that came from an animal that had been strangled instead of having its throat cut. And that they should not engage in sexual practices with those in a near degree of affinity. And in fact, this position of James, and the key marker, I think, is the issue of whether or not you eat idolothuta, idol meat. That key position that Christians, whatever else they do, should not eat idol meat, was widely accepted, but not by Paul. So inevitably, Paul and James would wind up in opposition, not only over that immediate matter, but over the question of fellowship at meal. So I would say that James was the pioneer of a literally catalytic position. Catalytic because the position itself disappeared within the course of centuries as Christianity developed. He established the idea that, as he puts it in the book of Acts, the purpose of this extension to the Gentiles was so that the tent of David might be restored again, as was promised in the book of Amos. And in making out that case, he maintained actually a distinction in his mind between Israel historically and genealogically and the Gentiles, but he saw Gentiles as being actively incorporated without circumcision. So it's a position which took Christianity into the 2nd century, and there, I think, did it a service until it basically converted itself, largely for demographic reasons, into a thoroughly Gentile organization in which the idea of Gentiles in any way being subservient to Israelites would no longer prove viable.
Do you think that in Galatians, the business in Antioch with the men from James intimidating Cephas, whether by intention or by his reaction, was that, do you think, a matter? I mean, we know it had to do with table fellowship. Would you identify the specific issue as the meat offered to idols rather than, or kosher in general? Because it doesn't make it specifically clear.
No, it really doesn't. It does not explain why it is that this issue of table fellowship arose. Only that, just as you say, at the time that Paul was speaking, Peter or Cephas had been joining in common meals, that is, including both Israelites and Gentiles. And then when the men from James came along, they stopped do that. And instead, Paul says they separated. And I think when it says separated, it means separated. I think it means they no longer took part in these meals. And Paul asserts that even Barnabas was taken up in what he calls their hypocrisy. Now, of course, from their point of view, it wasn't hypocrisy. From their point of view, they were keeping to a principle. Now, I find it interesting that in the book of Acts, James is presented in chapter 15 at one meeting in deciding, no, we're not going to require circumcision. And also in deciding, we're going to send a letter to Antioch and those in the diaspora. And we're going to tell them to refrain from food sacrificed to idol, blood, things strangled, and fornication. I think it's much more likely that those are not the result of a single meeting, but that there is a lapse between James' agreement that Paul and others could proselytize without requiring circumcision, and the statement that these converts, once they are part of us, should observe these points of the law. So I think that's one reason for which, when Paul returned to Antioch, he was returning to a new situation in that the movement had grown. There's an increasing number of Gentiles. And of course, if you increase the number of Gentiles, you're increasing the probability that they are the hosts rather than the Israelites being the hosts. And, the simple fact is you cannot trust a Gentile to keep kashrut. It's not reasonable because they are not embedded within that system. So I think that James likely agreed to the issue of circumcision in the meeting of the year 46, and that it took him until 52 to come to the judgment, to send out an actual letter. It's fascinating, really. The book of Acts doesn't talk about Paul writing letters, but it tells about James writing a letter. Writing a letter to set out these stipulations. So I think at that point, the letter had its impact. I wish Paul had told us what the underlying issue was. It may well have been, I think, eidolothuta. But in any case, the problem is, again, if you have a Gentile preparing a meal, how do you know where he acquired the meat?
Don't ask, don't tell in 1 Corinthians.
Excuse me?
As in 1 Corinthians, he says, don't ask, don't tell.
Don't ask, don't tell.
It's so comical that if the guy, your host, says, hey, I got a great deal on these steaks, they were sacrificed to Serapis. Okay, hand me the salad. Now I can't eat it. Thanks a lot. But yeah, let's just try to skate past that one.
Exactly. And I think you're exactly right. That 1 Corinthians 8, Paul's don't ask, don't tell, is in effect his belated response, which would have been a wiser response over the issues that came up in connection with Antioch. But the position that he himself took in 1 Corinthians 8 and then later repeated really does not amount to accepting what's usually called the apostolic decree. It's so called because although James is the principal author, he's acting with other apostles in Jerusalem. And there is, I think, a very clear line of cleavage between saying, no, you must not eat eidolothuta, and saying, don't ask, don't tell. I mean, in the end, there are those who try to argue that Paul honored the decree by saying, just as you suggest, if someone brags about his nice Diana steak or whatever it was, then you should refrain from having that. But I think that's a kind of belated attempt to paper over a serious difference. And in terms of discipline of the church in the early period, Paul just lost that argument. In the 2nd century, Justin Martyr is quite clear still, because, the issue of idolatry was important. And therefore, consuming eidolothuta was no mere kosher nicety. It's a matter of whether you belong to this world or not.
Eating from the table of demons. If that's what you think is going on, then hey, no thanks.
You shouldn't be doing it. Yeah, exactly.
Is Acts talking about, when it says that James wrote a letter, is it talking about our Epistle of James in the New Testament, or something else?
I see. Yeah. No. There he actually quotes the letter, and one of the issues in the interpretation of the Epistle of James is that this defining issue that I just referred to, which I think represents James' real historical impact on the development of the movement, is not directly engaged whatsoever. Instead, the Epistle of James has the look of being a fairly, if I can so put it, conventional letter about the wisdom of God, conveyed in terms of a proverbial approach, but with a very distinct eschatological perspective as well.
It's interesting, perhaps insignificant, that that James seems to be heavily influenced by Stoicism, which of course a lot of people were, Jew or Gentile, and then the other even more Stoic Jewish writing, 4th Maccabees, uses the 7 brothers who are horribly tortured to death. The issue for them is they will not eat banned food. So they'll give their lives for this. And this is used as the prime example of Stoicism. And these guys had a lot to be afraid of, but reason prevailed. So there's this strange connection. Make of it, I don't know.
Yeah. I think it's an important observation, because it appears to me that already in Philo of Alexandria, you can see that Platonism and Stoicism were beginning to mix. And what's fascinating is that as the New Testament unfolds in Hebrews and also the Epistle of James, you can also see a very similar mixture, and also a kind of more independent Stoicism in 4 Maccabees. So there seems to be a clearer synergy between what we could call wisdom Judaism and Greco-Roman philosophy than is often acknowledged. I mean, because of the developments from the 2nd century and later, the view emerges that rabbinic Judaism and Greco-Roman philosophy had nothing to do with one another. From the point of view of the rabbis, they're all a bunch of Epicureans, and that's not a good thing, as they saw it. But in the earlier period, in the pre-rabbinic period, there appears to have been a much greater degree of influence going back and forth. And some of that cross-pollination occurs in the New Testament as well. But I would want to emphasize, though, Jacob, the degree to which James himself was actually involved in that strikes me as more than questionable. That is, the letter of James seems to me to be pseudepigraphic.
Right. I was just asking you if Acts was quoting the Epistle of James, but I was not suggesting that James wrote it either.
Right. Absolutely. No, understood. It quotes something else. It says James said, and I think James said something really close to that.
The philosophy and Hebrew scripture question, Philo is obviously a very important figure in that. And I think it's interesting how there were Alexandrian Jews that agreed with him with the allegorizing and the ultimately moral character, and said, well, now that we understand that, who cares of what you eat or so on? He said, oh, whoa, wait just a minute. This is much like the Ismaili Shiites much later. Now that we know the essence of it, we don't need the actual observances. And Philo says, you can't do that. Now that you know the point of it, you should do it all the more, not less. So there were these different reactions, Jewish reactions to the Hellenistic wisdom.
Exactly so. And it's interesting how much energy Philo takes to resist that point of view. So, for example, to the argument that says, oh, well, you see, if circumcision is a symbol of intellectual obedience, if we're obedient, then we don't have to do it, right? So he even said, no, you have to keep it. But in order to make that case out, he also has to develop an elaborate argument about the connection between the soul and the body. So it seems rather clear to me that he was having to face up to living possibilities in Alexandria and elsewhere. I mean, in regard to that issue, I think of the description of the sons of the high priests in Jerusalem during the pre-Maccabean period, who, in order to compete in athletic games, which you did naked, would try to cover the fact that they had been circumcised by a procedure called epispasm, very painful procedure designed to bring skin down as if it were foreskin. Well, if there are people doing that, seems clear to me there are people avoiding the problem by not practicing circumcision at all. There's a movement in both directions. The poet Juvenal attacks people who are philo-Judaic by saying if you start worshiping one God and these lovely ethics, you're going to end up with a son who practices circumcision. Well, that's one possible move. But another possible move is in the opposite direction. And in one way, I think we can see Paul as being an example of these analogical Jews that are portrayed in Philo of Alexandria. And Paul, I think, demonstrates that it was possible as intellectual choice to see Judaism in those terms within his time.
Well, when he says, I'm independent of all men, and with Jews I am as a Jew, with the weak I am weak, which I think he meant the same thing. With those who keep the law, so do I. It was just like in Acts, where we're just going to keep these regulations so as not to needlessly scandalize Jews we're trying to work with. And Paul, apparently, it really was a matter of indifference. It was just PR, which you need not take as cynical and manipulative as people tend to do. He's just saying, look, I don't want to offend anybody. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. Well, why have like Bultmann used to say, an unnecessary stumbling block? And that makes perfect sense to me. And like he no longer thought it was binding on Jewish Christians, but you know what it says in 1 Corinthians, all things are lawful for me, but not everything makes sense to do.
Exactly, right. And he also appears to imagine, hence his statement in Romans, at the end of the day, all Israel will be saved. He also seems to imagine that indeed Israelites are going to practice this. It's going to continue. He doesn't even imagine the end of the temple, which occurred after he died. And therefore, he doesn't imagine really the end of Judaism. I think he conceives Judaism as being a practice which likely for the foreseeable future is going to be larger than Christianity. I mean, he is dealing with communities which are minuscule as compared to the power of synagogues throughout the Greco-Roman world. So he's operating, and the whole movement is operating very much on the margins.
Bob, I want to ask you real quick about your thoughts on Robert Eisman, Professor Eisman's views on James, because that's what you talk about in your contribution to the book heavily.
Well, what he says seems to be very plausible to me, especially if you connect it with Stauffer's idea of the caliphate of James and so on. But I have to admit, plausibility doesn't equal probability. It may well have been, I mean, that really kind of rings true to me. And with the patristic statements that James actually was some kind of an alternate priest, and that perhaps he was arrested because following a different ritual calendar, he actually celebrated Yom Kippur and somehow accessed the Holy of Holies on a different day. All of that is quite plausible, and it is tempting to say, well, okay, there must have been a lot more tiles in this mosaic, but we only have a few, so let's see what connections we can hypothesize. But and these things from the pseudo-Clementines and all that, or the Gospel of Thomas. We know that you will depart from us. Who do we go to then? So wherever you're coming from, go to James the Righteous, on whose account heaven and earth were created. So was he the head of a mission board? It kind of sounds like that, but you've got only snippets. And so with all these things, you just have to deliver like a probabilistic tentative verdict, just a possibility, until somebody finds another cache of unknown scrolls, like the autobiography of James, the brother of Jesus. Boy, would I love to see that. So I like it. It makes a lot of sense to me, but I have to admit, you can't dogmatize about it.
So now I want to ask you both about what you both think about James as he relates to Jesus. Was he the brother of Jesus, or was he not the brother of Jesus?
Well, I would say certainly he was the brother of Jesus. I mean, the only way you can get around it is like Jerome did by saying, oh, when the New Testament says brother, it means cousin. You know, Greek is a wonderful language. It's very easy to distinguish a cousin from a brother. And of course, he's named as among four brothers and an unnumbered and unnamed collection of sisters. So that part of it, from my point of view, seems straightforward. But as I said early on, that's also the stumbling block, because the doctrine that Mary was a virgin at the time of Jesus' birth and after kind of undermines the claim. And I do think this is one reason for which James has been persistently overlooked, not only in popular imagination, but also in scholarship. It is sometimes difficult to give a good hearing to this material because of those dogmatic reservations.
Well, Richard Carrier, as a mythicist, is attracted to the idea that, oh no, I met the brother of the Lord. Well, you know, that just means James the Christian. To me, that is so absurd. I don't mean to offend Richard in case he gets a hold of this, but that just seems as if he had just said, I met James the Christian. Well, what else was he? A Mithraist, a Buddhist?
Exactly.
I do kind of like, oh my gosh, I'm losing, I can't, G.A. Wells's suggestion that, that there's some evidence of there being a separate class of missionaries, especially if you think the apostles sitting on the 12 thrones judging the tribes of Israel would imply that they remained located in the Holy Land, and that Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles. Well, in that case, if there was an auxiliary group of missionaries, and that's what Paul is referring to in 1 Corinthians, am I not allowed to take a sister as wife along with me as Cephas and the brothers of the Lord? Does he mean Simon and Judah and so forth, or is he talking about a class of them? And I think the parable, if it is one, of the sheep and the goats is not a social gospel parable. That, oh yeah, any down and out person is Jesus. That's very profound. I love that, but I don't think that's the point. This is not original to me, but the idea that my brethren are the missionaries, because the vicissitudes described there, you didn't help them, you didn't visit them, give them shelter, feed them, etc. That sounds so much like the mission charge. Don't worry, God will take care of you through those who listen to your preaching. It seems to me that that's what it refers to, and that's real evidence that the brethren of the Lord, again, like in 3 John, was a missionary group, and that if we take seriously that Gospel of Thomas saying, and also in the letter of Peter to James in the Pseudo-Clementines, where it's very clear that whoever wrote that thought of James as the head of the mission board. And then Thomas, wherever you go, report back to James. That kind of makes sense to me. And in that sense, it might not be in Galatians saying that he was the blood brother or any kind of natural brother of Jesus. But again, who knows? It's
That's right. And of course, there's a difference between the usage in the plural and the usage in the singular. So, for example, if you talked about brethren, brothers, they're this idea of a class of missionaries, or even a regional designation, the brothers of Jesus in connection with Galilee. That would make some sense. But when it's singular, so for example, this is also the way Josephus uses it. Josephus talks about the death of James and describes his execution, and in the course of doing that, refers to him as the brother of Jesus who was called the Christ. Now, under those circumstances, I think Josephus is indicating the way in which this James, which after all just means Jacob, right? The way this Jacob is distinguished from any other Jacob. Oh, he's the one who's called brother of the Lord, or the case of Josephus, the brother of Jesus who was called Christ. So I would make a distinction between the singular and also the way in which he is called the Lord's brother, whether it's Josephus or Paul in Galatians, where it becomes important at that stage for Paul to tell you which James he has in mind, since by the time he's in Jerusalem, James, the son of Zebedee, is dead. He'd been killed by Agrippa I. So he talks about James. He's going to have to distinguish him somehow, and so calls him the brother of the Lord. And then, of course, also refers to him that way elsewhere. So overall, I think the references are fairly straightforward, though I completely agree that there is obviously a wider use of adelphoi, of the plural of brother. An aspect we haven't talked about, and it has to do, I think, with why James was executed under Ananus in the year 62, is that he became a prominent figure in Jerusalem because of his practice in connection with the temple. And this, I think, intersects with what Bob was helpfully telling us about Robert Eisenman's position. The part of Eisenman which I also find attractive is that which identifies a strongly ritual element within James' position. This does not come to the surface in this early portion of Acts in chapter 15, when James is sending out his letter about circumcision and which elements of the law do have to be maintained. But it's very interesting that the elements of the law which
Can you hear me, Bruce?
ritual. Yeah, I can hear you. I just had some kind of lapse in my system, I'm afraid.
Yeah, just
I'm
repeat what you said
sorry.
the last 10 seconds. It's fine.
Oh, of course. The early development in the book of Acts in chapter 15, when it speaks about what James has to say to converts to Christianity who are Gentiles, actually has an emphatically ritual element. That is, it's related to questions of circumcision, as we've said, idolothuta, blood, things strangled, and sexual relations within degrees of relational affinity. So you would expect that there was some kind of underlying concern with this in James' position, which doesn't at that early stage come to the surface. But later in the book of Acts, James is portrayed as being himself dedicated to the practice of the Nazirite vow, to the extent that he also involves other people in undertaking that vow. Now, the vow requires a period of abstinence, usually for approximately 1 month, though it could be longer, in which one dedicates oneself to a practice of exceptional purity, not having any contact with wine to the point of not eating grapes, for example. And during the time also, you refrain from cutting the hair or the beard. Interestingly, men or women can take part in the Nazirite vow, and at the close of the vow, this hair, which is then understood to have been consecrated, which is the sense of the term Nazir, Nazirite, this hair, which is understood to have been consecrated is actually brought as a sacrifice to the temple in association with other sacrifices. Now, since we did the book, there's been much more information come to light about the Nazirite vow, both in the discussion of the literature. There's a fine PhD thesis done by Stuart Chepney, and also in epigraphal elements that show us people inscribing their dedication as Nazirites. What it shows us is that this was a practice of particular devotion to the temple that required a considerable amount of wealth and brought with it an enormous amount of recognition from the general population in Jerusalem. I got interested in this issue because I've recently completed a project on the great-granddaughter of Herod the Great, Berenice, and she heroically attempted to stop the final revolt against the Romans by appealing both to the Roman side and to the Jewish side by undertaking a Nazirite vow in Jerusalem just as the war was breaking out. She was just an extraordinary, heroic figure. And that didn't work, but the memory of Berenice made its impact nonetheless, not only in Jewish but also in Roman sources. And what it shows us is that the Nazirite vow was not only, as it were, a matter of private devotion. It had a very heavy public aspect, and it was extremely expensive because one sacrificed not only the hair on one's head, literally, but also the number of animals required. You can read them in Numbers chapter 6, is really quite onerous, with the result that wealthier donors sometimes used to pay for the Nazirite vows of other people. Now, Berenice didn't have anyone pay for her, didn't have to. There are other royal figures who did the same thing. But Paul, interestingly, when he goes to Jerusalem, very interested in making what he calls the offering of the Gentiles in his letter to the Romans, is incorporated within the Nazirite vow, according to the portions of the book of Acts that describe Paul being in Jerusalem with James. Now, that all suggests that James was a well-established, well-recognized Nazirite, which also explains why he, when he was killed, is a cause taken up by the populace of Jerusalem, not just Christians, but people who regard this execution as being against the law and irregular, and they make a delegation to send to the incoming Roman procurator, Albinus, to protest what happened, and he in fact removed the high priest and installed someone else. So this suggests to us that, and this is the part of Eisenman's approach that I find appealing, if James had established himself as a Nazirite in Jerusalem, that would go a long way towards explaining the priestly affinities that developed over the course of time, and also why he was held in such very high esteem, and why it was not at all limited to the followers of his brother, that he, for that moment while the temple still stood, actually had a greater reputation in Jerusalem than Jesus himself did.
Well, in the, I guess it's again the Pseudo-Clementines or the Ascents of James or whatever, I forget, when they put James on the spot and say, well, tell us about the Son of Man. He's, oh, yes, he's sitting at the right hand. And I say, even the just has been deceived. They're shocked. They had no idea. And he was a big wig despite that. I mean, until that.
Yes, I think, that part, and this scene also comes up in Hegesippus. I think this element of of James, the part of the hagiography that portrays him as actually being a surprise Christian to some people, is actually plausible. You know, you might well in Jerusalem have thought of him as a Nazirite, among many others. I mean, who knew? You know, he was also devoted to Jesus. Yeah.
Well, I think sometimes about Akiva, I think, was the one that backed Simon Bar Kokhba as the Messiah.
That's
well, he backed the wrong horse, but that he didn't go down as a terrible heretic because of it. They didn't excommunicate him. No, you're wrong.
No, not at all.
So exactly. He didn't believe Jesus was the Messiah, like these kooky sectarians said. That didn't necessarily mean, in the eyes of everybody else, that you were a blasphemer, a member of a different religion. That's anachronistic.
Yeah, no, that's exactly that. I think that's a good comparison. And that, you know, as it were, James might have got away with it, but didn't in the way. I mean, Akiva, of course, ends up having an enormous influence on the development of rabbinic literature. He's criticized for his support of Bar Kokhba, and yet he's accepted as an authority.
Yeah. Well, there were even some Jews who were willing to use the name of Jesus as an incantation. Others didn't like it and gave him grief for it, but the very fact that some of them were doing it. They weren't Christians, but it was like the so-called strange exorcist. He didn't belong to our group, but he was using your name to cast out demons. So he told him to cease and desist. And Jesus, you did what? We need all the friends we can get.
Yeah, exactly.
I love that story.
I'm going to take a couple of super chat questions real quick before we continue. Kathy Brocado, thank you for your super sticker. Appreciate it. Macaulay, thank you for your super chat. How directly do Ebionite Christology and adherence to Jewish law reflect the theological positions of the historical James?
I would say myself that it's partial. That is, on the crucial issue of circumcision, the Ebionites and James go there in their separate directions. On the issue of circumcision, the Ebionites maintain it, and this appears to have been a continuing part of their theology, whereas James is willing to accept that Gentiles who convert to the movement will be baptized, but that circumcision will not be required. However, there is, in my opinion, a very important aspect in which they do agree with one another, and that is that James believed that the reason you accept Gentiles coming in an ancillary position, that is, they remain Gentiles. He doesn't agree with Paul that everyone who believes in Jesus is an Israelite. You know, that is a typically radical Pauline position which no one else at the time agreed with, and which even today I think you would find very few people to adhere to as an idea. As James saw it, yes, they're with us, but that doesn't make them part of Israel. They're with us for the purpose, as James puts it, quoting Amos, of supporting the fallen house of David. There's something that's crucial to understand. James, like Jesus, he belongs to the house of David. He is part of this. And the reason he's part of it is that Joseph is his father. But wait a minute, that must also apply in the case of Jesus. If Jesus is to be understood as son of David in the ordinary sense, in the genealogical sense, there's only one way for that to be possible. You know, the virgin birth doesn't cover making someone a son of David. You need a father who's from the house of David. So when Jesus is referred to as David's son in the Gospels, which he is several times, and sometimes, you know, I think that's a indication of the influence of James, and that is a place where James and the Ebionites agree with one another.
Also, the fact that the Ebionites didn't believe in the supernatural conception of Jesus, for
Right.
them to say James is his brother, no problem.
No problem. Exactly. No difficulty, whatever. Hmm.
Oh, fascinating. Wow. I love this stuff.
Reinhard Schneider, thank you for your super chat. One more super chat to show how happy I am that Dr. Bob is back. We need creative minds. You are appreciated. Thank you,
Oh,
Reinhard.
thank you.
You are indeed. It's been great fun.
Now, Dr. Hughes has a couple of questions. I'm gonna pull it up right now.
Hmm.
Frank, thank you for being a member of the channel. Appreciate it. In reference to the Jerusalem conference, it's instructive to note that in Galatians, Paul thinks the decree allowing Gentile men not to be circumcised and possibly not keeping other parts of Torah is enforceable. But the reason for Galatians is that it didn't work. By Romans, the decree of the Jerusalem conference is deader than a doornail.
Well, it's good to hear from Frank again. I agree. The reason for Galatians is that it didn't work. Well, there's a disagreement. I think there's a disagreement going on in Galatians. In Paul's mind, he thinks that the right hand of fellowship he was given in Jerusalem authorized him to go to the Gentiles. He did. And I think he also assumes that others will concentrate on the circumcision. Paul's problem, I think, in Galatians, and his fundamental, as it were, life problem, is the notion of others who did exist in the movement, that those who adhere to Christ do have to keep at least some parts of the Torah, and Paul was extremely wary of this concept. I don't see there being a great deal of change in that position throughout the course of his life. I think he goes at the question from varying points of view in his letters, but I don't think he resolves it, and I don't think others resolve it either. The question, I think, is overtaken by the surprising event that Gentile Christians came to overwhelm Israelite Christians, and also overtaken by the events of the destruction of the temple twice, in 70 and in 135.
What do you think? I hope I'm not interrupting the callers. What do you think of the thesis of Sam K. Williams, Jesus' death as saving event? I've always found that really striking, that the idea that, you Jews have to believe in Jesus too, because it does say the nations, the world. No, that meant accept us, the Gentile world, which is probably true. And Jewish Christians said, we've always had the benefit of the Levitical sacrifices, so we're not unclean in the sight of God like our poor Gentile friends are. Okay, because they're not under the covenant. That's fine. They can eat all the bacon biscuits they want, just that we don't. So that how is God going to hold his nose to accept all these ex-pagans?
Mm-hmm.
And William says this passage in Romans that God had held his peace with all the Gentile sinners, but finally accepted the martyrdom of Jesus as a sacrifice to cleanse them. Does that make any sense? It does to me, but I don't know if I'm understanding it correctly. Even.
Yeah, I think it does. I think it does make some sense, and especially insofar as, again, within the thought world of Paul, we have to imagine the temple still functioning. After all, he ends up dying because he went to that very temple to offer sacrifice. So he thought it worked. And therefore, the idea that he conceived of a possibility of Israel being Israel until the end is, I think, one that we should actively countenance. He does not get to the point, for example, of telling us in a way which is definitive whether he thought that Israelites as such needed to believe in Jesus. It seems to me that reading Romans, he leaves that fuzzy because where he is concerned in Romans, and this goes over, I think, to Frank Hughes's point, what he is concerned to do in Romans is to people generally. And that led him to this idea that the law is something which is given in order to make any person, wherever it's practiced, aware of the necessity of grace. Now, that widespread anthropological position that Paul takes in Romans then covers over, as it were, this question of what is to happen to the distinction between Jew and Greek when we come to the very end. I think there are hints in Paul, but he does deliberately invoke the language of mystery at that point.
I wonder, lately, this goes a little bit beyond this whole thing, but the idea of a double covenant theology that has been put forth by more theologically liberal people, I could be wrong, but I'm getting the impression that even conservative evangelicals are beginning to say the same thing. I remember hearing Ann Coulter once saying that, oh, don't worry, Jews, you're okay. You don't have to believe in Jesus. You're going to heaven anyway. She's a conservative Presbyterian. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And a lot of the pro-Israel, so-called Christian Zionist movement, they seem to think that too. That look, hey, they're okay as they are. Do you pick any of that up? I don't have I'm not working from a representative sample or anything.
Yeah, I have to say I have a very similar impression. Yeah, and I'm not altogether sure what to make of it, because to some extent, positions taken by public figures, can be performative. So I'm not sure just how seriously to take them.
Interesting. Wow.
Frank wrote this in the chat. Yes, he goes at the question quite differently in Romans because of his wanting to appeal to both Jewish and Gentile Roman congregations.
Yes, I completely agree with that. I think that he is aware indirectly, because he never visited Rome before he wrote to them. He's aware indirectly of tensions and of the relative weakness of the Jewish aspects of the communities as a result of Roman policy. So there, the balance of power has shifted. And so he does, I think, deliberately set out a more protective attitude towards Judaism. And I agree that this is one of the incentives for him to develop this broader anthropological view of law. And I, for one, am very happy for those problems in Rome, just because it got Paul to sort out how he would then see the Torah in relation to the questions of eschatology that he emphasized more elsewhere.
Speaking of anthropology in this, one of the most surprising things to me is in the Epistle of Aristeas, where this Jewish Hellenistic apologist is saying, you might scoff at some of the commandments. You can't eat mice. What the heck? And he says, look, I know it's trivial, but that's the point. It's an attempt to build a high wall so that we don't assimilate and lose the whole thing. He's already looked at this through a sociological, anthropological list in the 2nd century or whatever it was BCE.
Yep.
It's
That's
amazing. Right. And that seems to me to be a key to Paul's approach. These things are the ethnic markers of the Old Testament people of God. They don't apply to you dumb Gentiles. You don't have to learn a whole new set of mores to become a Christian. I think that's what he's saying in Galatians, that you and I both know it's Christ, not the works of the law that save, and so on.
Right.
But I was
moreover, if you try to apply this law, of which you have no real familiarity, all you'll do is mess up. That is the only conceivable thing that could happen.
Oh man, you think you know stuff, and then they're bombarded by shocking new data. That's my story.
So one last thing I want to ask before we close is both of y'all's take on Galatians 1:19. I'll start with you first, Bob. Can you tell us? Can you remind the audience why you think that Galatians 1:19, "Brother of the Lord," is a later Christian addition to Galatians?
Yeah, it has to do with, like, we don't have enough early manuscript evidence to decide it one way or the other. But Tertullian, that passage would come in so handy for him when he's trying to establish the authority of the 12 over Paul, but he doesn't quote it. And that seems very strange. He's asleep at the switch or something. And so non-mythicists, by the way, were the first to say, I think that wasn't in Tertullian's copy. And that it was interpolated later to fill the gap polemically that Tertullian left. That makes some sense to me. It ain't much, but it's some evidence that it might not have been original.
Bruce?
It's difficult to prove a negative.
Right.
I agree that we don't actually have the autograph copies we would love to have when we're dealing with Paul. But I'm not too surprised at James not being included in a discussion of the 12, because he wasn't one of the 12. He does have a independent status as an apostle. And it would seem to me that there is parallel information which would suggest that Paul was familiar with James, namely when he lists those by whom Jesus was seen after his death in 1 Corinthians 15. He refers both to Cephas, followed by the 12, and thereafter to James. It seems to me that this is the way in which Paul thinks of James. He recognizes his status as the Lord's brother, but disagrees with it profoundly, as we've already said. But I think also understands him to be in a separate category, as Paul himself is, and as also Barnabas is.
Yeah, that's interesting. Wow.
All right, everybody. I want to remind you all before we close that the brother of Jesus is in the description below and in the pinned comments. If you want to purchase a book, you click on the affiliate link and you can purchase it. With that being said, Professor Price and Professor Chilton, thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good to talk with you, Bob.
Oh, it's great to hear and see you again. Oh.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.